On February 26, 2022, the United States and its allies unleashed what many considered their ultimate financial weapon. This was not a missile, a tank, or a new piece of military hardware. It was a sanction, a decision executed not on a battlefield, but in the quiet halls of finance ministries and central banks. In a coordinated effort designed to cripple Russia's economy and halt its war in Ukraine, Western nations took a step that, until that moment, few in the international community believed was truly possible. They froze approximately $300 billion of the Russian central bank's foreign reserves. The immediate objective was to render Russia's massive financial fortress, a war chest painstakingly built over years, completely useless. At first, it appeared as a stunning demonstration of the West's overwhelming dominance of the global financial system. The initial shockwave was immense, sending tremors through global markets. But now, more than 2.5 years later, the unintended consequences of this action are becoming alarmingly clear. The sanction did not just punish Russia. It acted as a profound wake-up call to the rest of the world. It compelled every nation outside of the West's immediate circle of allies to confront a new and perilous reality. The dollar-based system they all depended on could be turned against them at any moment, not for legal or commercial reasons, but for purely political ones. This is not the first time a great power has used finance as an instrument of war. In fact, it is a recurring pattern that echoes throughout modern history. First, a dominant power establishes control over the world's financial architecture. Second, it leverages that control to punish its adversaries and enforce its will. Third, this weaponization forces other nations, out of self-preservation, to begin constructing alternative systems to shield themselves. And finally, the original weapon control over the system begins to lose its potency. The dominant power, in a bid to display its strength, inadvertently accelerates the erosion of the very foundation of that strength. Consider the Suez Crisis of 1956, when Britain, France, and Israel invaded Egypt to reclaim the canal. The United States used its financial might to force their withdrawal. Washington applied relentless economic pressure. President Eisenhower blocked Britain from accessing a desperately needed loan from the International Monetary Fund and instructed his Treasury Secretary to prepare to sell off the U.S. government's holdings of British pound-denominated bonds. This threat to crash the value of the pound, combined with an oil embargo from Arab nations and the U.S. refusal to help, created economic panic in London. The financial pressure worked, and the troops withdrew. But the event laid bare the vulnerability of the British pound, accelerating its decline as the world's primary reserve currency and paving the way for the U.S. dollar's undisputed reign. It was a short-term victory for American foreign policy, but for Britain, it was the definitive signal that its financial supremacy was over. Now, let me show you the data that proves the same cycle is repeating itself. We will examine why the dollar's decline is accelerating and how this single, powerful sanction may have been the catalyst that pushed the world's preeminent currency toward the beginning of its long exit from the world stage. To truly grasp the monumental impact of this event, one must first understand the weapons that were deployed. The West wielded two primary financial instruments against Russia, each targeting a different part of the global economic machinery. First, major Russian banks were ejected from SWIFT. SWIFT, which stands for the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, serves as the central nervous system for the world's banks. It does not move money itself. Instead, it is a highly secure messaging network that transmits the instructions for nearly every major international payment, from a multi-billion-dollar oil deal to a simple wire transfer. Founded in 1973 by 239 banks across 15 countries, it was created to replace the slow and error-prone telex system. Think of it as a private encrypted postal service and universal language for finance, connecting over 11,000 institutions in more than 200 countries. Being expelled from SWIFT is the financial equivalent of having your internet, phone lines, and mail service all severed simultaneously. It isolates a nation's banks from the global conversation, making international trade extraordinarily difficult. But the second weapon was the true earthquake, the one that crossed a previously unthinkable line, the freezing of the Russian central bank's foreign currency reserves. For decades, countries have diligently built up vast emergency funds known as foreign exchange reserves. These are not just symbolic piles of cash. They are enormous portfolios of assets denominated in other countries' currencies, predominantly US dollars, but also euros, Japanese yen, and British pounds. These reserves serve as a nation's ultimate financial backstop. They are used to pay for critical imports like food and medicine, to service foreign currency debts, and most crucially, to stabilize their own currency during a crisis by buying it on the open market. Anticipating conflict and the sanctions that would follow, Russia had spent years constructing what it believed to be an impenetrable financial fortress, amassing over $630 billion in reserves. They were profoundly mistaken. In the most sweeping financial action ever taken against a major global economy, the G7 nations simply issued a decree. Approximately $300 billion of those assets, held in accounts in financial centers like New York, London, Paris, and Tokyo, were now untouchable. The fortress Russia had so carefully constructed was rendered useless in an instant because the keys were held by its adversaries. The money wasn't a physical hoard in a Moscow vault. It existed as digital entries on ledgers in foreign banks, controlled by foreign governments. The immediate effect was as devastating as intended. The Russian ruble plummeted in value. To halt the freefall, Russia's central bank was forced to implement emergency capital controls and hike interest rates to an astronomical 20%. But as the initial shock subsided, a different sentiment began to ripple through the world, far beyond Moscow. In the finance ministries and central bank boardrooms of the non-Western world, the feeling was not one of satisfaction. It was a quiet, creeping dread. Leaders in Beijing, New Delhi, and Brazil watched as a fundamental principle of international relations was shattered. The doctrine of sovereign immunity, which generally protects a state's assets from seizure by another state, had always been assumed to extend to central bank reserves. This was the unspoken rule of the global financial system. A country's national savings were sacrosanct and immune from political confiscation. That rule was now broken, and every finance minister and central bank governor outside the Western alliance was forced to confront an unsettling question. If they can do this to Russia, a nuclear-armed member of the UN Security Council, what could they do to us? That single chilling question triggered a systemic crisis of trust in the U.S.-led financial order. To understand the depth of this crisis, put yourself in the shoes of a finance minister of a large developing nation. Your country is not an adversary of the United States, but neither is it a formal treaty ally. For decades, you have played by the established rules. You have guided your nation's economic policy, promoted exports to the world, and diligently saved the proceeds in what you were consistently told was the world's safest and most liquid asset, U.S. government bonds. This asset was ubiquitously labeled risk-free, but that label always carried an implicit assumption. It meant free of credit risk or the risk that the U.S. government would be unable or unwilling to pay back its debt. Suddenly, in the spring of 2022, you are confronted with a new, unquantifiable risk you had never been forced to seriously consider: political risk. You come to the stark realization that if your country's foreign policy were to ever diverge significantly from Washington's, perhaps over a trade dispute or regional conflict, or a disagreement on human rights, your entire national savings, the bedrock of your country's economic stability, could be frozen and wielded as a coercive weapon against you. This was no longer a theoretical scenario from an academic paper. It had just happened in real time to a G20 economy. The core infrastructure of the global economy, the SWIFT network, and the U.S. dollar itself was revealed to be not a neutral, public utility for global commerce, but a system of control directed by one geopolitical bloc. Nowhere did these alarm bells ring louder than in China. As the world's largest exporter, and for many years, the largest holder of foreign reserves, China suddenly viewed its trillion-dollar-plus investment in the United States in a terrifying new light. What had once been a symbol of its economic symbiosis with the U.S. now appeared to be a colossal strategic vulnerability. Chinese policymakers immediately wargamed the most obvious and dangerous flashpoint, a potential escalation of tensions with the United States over Taiwan. The West's actions against Russia provided a clear and frightening precedent. In such a scenario, China's trillions of dollars in U.S. Treasury bonds could instantly be transformed from an asset into a weapon aimed directly at its own economy. China and other emerging powers did not respond with panic. A sudden, massive sell-off of U.S. dollars would have triggered a global financial crisis, harming their own economies in the process. Instead, they initiated a slow, quiet, but deeply significant strategic pivot. A new consensus began to form in capitals across the globe. These countries recognized the urgent need for an insurance policy. They needed a plan B, and so they began to earnestly explore a series of critical questions. How can we conduct trade with one another without relying on the U.S. dollar? How can we develop secure financial messaging systems that operate independently of SWIFT? And, most importantly, how can we store our national wealth in a form that is immune to political seizure? The sanction that was intended to be the ultimate demonstration of the dollar's power ended up exposing its greatest vulnerability. It revealed to the world that the price of admission to the dollar system was potential submission to the policy dictates of the U.S. government. For a growing number of powerful nations, that price was becoming far too high to pay. This pervasive sense of vulnerability rapidly translated into concrete action. The narrative of de-dollarization is no longer a fringe theory. It is now a discernible trend, clearly visible in economic data and strategic policy shifts around the world. First, consider Russia itself. The sanctions were designed to trigger a complete collapse of its economy. That did not happen. After the initial shock and a GDP contraction in 2022, the Russian economy stabilized and, according to the IMF, returned to growth in 2023 and 2024. How was this possible? Russia successfully pivoted its vast energy exports away from Europe and toward Asia, primarily to China and India. This demonstrated that a major commodity exporting economy could, with great difficulty, survive and function largely outside the confines of the Western financial system. This pivot was only achievable because a parallel financial architecture was already being constructed and could be rapidly scaled. The most dramatic shift has been in direct trade settlement. Commerce between Russia and China has exploded, soaring to over $240 billion in 2023. By late 2025, Russian officials reported that over 99% of this enormous trade volume is now settled in their respective national currencies, the ruble and the yuan. This means a Russian oil company can sell its product to a Chinese refiner and receive payment in yuan, which it can then use to buy Chinese goods, all without a single dollar changing hands and without any transaction passing through a U.S.-based bank. China's cross-border interbank payment system, or CIPS, has experienced meteoric growth. Launched in 2015, CIPS is China's answer to SWIFT. However, there is a key difference. While SWIFT is purely a messaging system, CIPS is designed to handle both financial messaging and the actual settlement of payments in yuan. In 2024, the value of transactions processed by CIPS surged by 43%, reaching approximately $24 trillion. It is rapidly becoming the primary highway for non-dollar denominated trade, especially within Asia and among developing nations. The BRICS group, originally Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, is now at the forefront of the movement to create a multipolar currency world. The bloc has expanded significantly, welcoming major oil producers like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, a direct challenge to the old financial order. At their 2024 summit, the group announced further discussions on creating BRICS Pay, a unified payment system designed to facilitate trade in local currencies, bypassing the dollar-based system entirely. For 50 years, the global oil trade has been almost exclusively priced and settled in U.S. dollars. This petrodollar system originated from a 1974 agreement between the United States and Saudi Arabia, where the U.S. offered military security in exchange for Saudi Arabia pricing its oil in dollars and recycling those dollars into used treasury bonds. This arrangement created a permanent global demand for dollars. In June 2024, that 50-year security deal officially expired. While Saudi Arabia has not abandoned the dollar, it is now openly exploring selling its oil in other currencies, including the Chinese yuan, a move that would have been unthinkable just a few years prior. Perhaps the most telling data point is what central banks are doing with their national savings. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has been on a slow decline for 2 decades, down from over 70% in 2000. By the second quarter of 2025, that figure had fallen to just 56.3%, according to the latest IMF data. Where is that capital flowing? It is not migrating to other major Western currencies, like the euro or the yen. The real strategic shift is into 2 specific assets: gold and, to a lesser extent, the Chinese yuan. Central banks, led by China, Russia, and India, embarked on an unprecedented gold-buying spree, purchasing record amounts in 2022, 2023, and 2024. Over these 3 years, central banks added more than 3,200 metric tons to their reserves. Gold is the ultimate neutral reserve asset. It is a physical bearer asset that can be held within a country's own vaults, where it cannot be frozen by a foreign government. Simultaneously, countries are systematically reducing their exposure to U.S. government debt. China's officially reported holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds have plummeted from a peak of over $1.3 trillion in 2013 to around $700 billion by late 2025. This slow but persistent divestment is a clear and deliberate effort by Beijing to reduce its financial vulnerability to the United States. Now, it is easy to get swept up in the narrative of de-dollarization and proclaim the imminent death of the dollar. That would be a gross oversimplification and is demonstrably untrue. The reality is that the structural barriers to completely displacing the dollar as the world's premier currency remain immense. First and foremost is the unparalleled depth, liquidity, and safety of U.S. financial markets. There is simply no other market in the world capable of absorbing the trillions of dollars that central banks and large institutional investors need to park safely and access instantly. The market for U.S. government bonds is the most liquid financial market in human history. If the U.S. Treasury market is an ocean, the Chinese bond market is a large lake, and most other national bond markets are mere ponds. For the giant whales of international finance, like central banks managing hundreds of billions in reserves, only the ocean provides enough space to maneuver. Second is the powerful force of inertia. The global financial system has been running on the dollar as its operating system for nearly a century. Everyone uses it because everyone else uses it. It is the default language of international business, the primary currency for invoicing trade, and the unit of account for most global commodities. Convincing the entire world to switch simultaneously will be a nearly impossible coordination problem, akin to persuading the entire planet to stop speaking English tomorrow and adopt a new language. Finally, there is no viable contender ready to take its place. The euro, the second most held reserve currency, is the currency of a union of nations, but it lacks a unified government budget or a single, jointly issued eurobond that could rival the safety and scale of a U.S. Treasury bond. The Chinese yuan, despite its growing influence in trade, is not freely convertible. The Chinese government maintains strict capital controls, limiting the flow of money in and out of the country, and global investors remain wary of the lack of transparency in its financial system. For now, the dollar remains the least bad option among a field of flawed alternatives. So no, the dollar is not going to collapse tomorrow. What we are witnessing is not a sudden cardiac arrest, but the clear onset of a chronic long-term weakening. The world is transitioning from a unipolar currency system to a multipolar or fragmented one. The sanction against Russia did not kill the dollar, but it infected it with a long-term illness. It dramatically accelerated a dollarization trend that now appears irreversible. The inevitable result of this trend is the fracturing of the global economy into competing financial blocks. On one side stands the established U.S.-led bloc, organized around the dollar, the euro, and the SWIFT network. On the other side, a new bloc is coalescing around the BRICS nations, with the Chinese yuan at its core and systems like CIPS as its plumbing. This fragmented world is inherently less efficient, more costly, and more unstable for everyone. For the United States, it signals the slow erosion of what a former French finance minister famously called its exorbitant privilege. This privilege, the unique ability to purchase foreign goods, fund its government deficits, and project power by printing a currency that the rest of the world is forced to save, has allowed the U.S. to borrow more cheaply and sustain a higher standard of living for decades. As global demand for the dollar gradually wanes, the cost of borrowing for the U.S. government, for American corporations, and ultimately for ordinary American consumers will inevitably rise. Even more consequentially, America's capacity to shake global events without firing a shot will diminish. The potency of financial sanctions, its most powerful foreign policy tool of the 21st century, will be blunted as an increasing share of the world's economic activity takes place on financial rails that America does not control. The 2022 sanction against Russia's central bank was a watershed moment in modern financial history. It was a tactical decision that forced nations around the world to begin choosing sides. In exercising its power, the United States prioritized a short-term geopolitical objective over its long-term role as the trusted steward of the global financial commons. It was an awesome display of strength, but it came at the expense of the trust that had underpinned that strength for 80 years. The era of unipolar currency dominance is drawing to a close. A new, more complex, and more contested era has already begun. The great game of currencies is now afoot. What do you think? Is a multipolar currency world inevitable? Will this fragmentation lead to a more balanced and equitable global economy, or a more chaotic and conflict-prone one? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.